Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to see all of you. I'm going to do something I think a bit different from what we've been talking about, because I want to talk about the substructure of not just intentions but of intentionality. So collective intentionality, a group of organisms somehow sharing an intentional state, where sharing means more than simply simultaneous possession of states with like content, is a puzzling phenomenon. For many contemporary philosophers, it is particularly puzzling because they start with the assumption that intentionality itself is, first and foremost, a phenomenon of the individual organism. And clearly, individual organisms, especially individual humans, possess intentional states that are directed at the world they live in. And it can be difficult to make sense out of someone who might deny that there are individual humans that possess intentional states, though there are people who do that. But given that individuals possess intentionality, it is a challenge to account for the possession of intentionality by super-individual groups and institutions. After all, they have a very different makeup from singular individuals. Figuring out what conditions would make it true that Tom, Dick, and Harry collectively believe that Arsenal ought to win the premiership, or that the University of New Hampshire is seeking to widen its applicant pool, is not only difficult, but sometimes it raises specters of ghostly metaphysics, group minds, and super-individual consciousnesses. So far, many different attempts to construct a viable notion of collective intentionality all focus on how to erect a superstructure of intentional states held collectively on a basis of intentional states held individually. And if you want a good survey, Bernhardt's entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia is very, very nicely done. Well, that's all well and good, and the various theories are fascinating, but I want to look in a different direction. The theme of this essay is that all intentionality, not just intentions, but intentionality, is collective. And my argument derives from thinking through the substructures of intentionality, whether in individuals or in super-individual collectives. Now, given discussions of the substructures of intentionality in the 20th century, and more recently, there are two obvious ways I might go. Like Frege and his followers, I might note the priority of the judgment. Ideas or concepts have meaning only in the context of judgments, and then talk about the intentionality of the elements of judgment, the intentional substructure of thought. Or I could talk a lot about the brain, about neurophysiology and other aspects of the physical substructures that support intentionality, but I won't be doing either of those. I'll focus instead on the fact that shared practices within a community are a necessary condition of intentionality, even in the individual. The shared practices, moreover, must have a normative dimension or force to them. That is, they are not merely regular behavioral patterns. I think that basically means that they are not constituted by the fact that some natural law or physical structure imposes a particular behavioral profile on the entities within the community. It is not, in my sense, for instance, a shared practice that rocks fall when unsupported near the surface of the Earth. It's not a shared practice that the planets describe elliptical orbits around their central attractant, nor is it a shared practice that fish breathe through gills. So, there's the agenda, by the way. I'm not very good at coordinating my reading and my slides. It looks more complicated than maybe it is. The sections are, thankfully, each pretty short. So here's the, I should have had this up at the beginning. There's the basic statements I just did. So now we'll go to part 2, individualism and the independence of the mental. One can think of my project here as yet another attack on the fairly extreme individualism that has characterized thought about thought and mind, arguably since Descartes, with a few notable exceptions. That view sees individual intentionality-capable organisms as the fundamental denizens, the atoms, as it were, of a realm that is conceptually, and often they think metaphysically, independent of the realm of natural law. The view tends to be strongly dualistic, mind and body, and nothing in between. How exactly the relationship between the realm of intentionality and the realm of natural law is to be construed was, of course, one of the major challenges facing such a philosophy. But, what alternative is there to this classical dualism? I don't find its equally classic opponent, reductive materialism, any more attractive. Now, I agree that mentality or intentionality is conceptually independent of, relatively conceptually independent of, for instance, the physical. One cannot, without losing important expressive power, restate a mentalistic assertion in the language of pure physics cum chemistry. But the metaphysical dualism, I think, has got to go. In contrast to dualism and reductive materialism, I want to promote a vision of the intentional as embedded in a natural realm, the understanding of which cannot be exhausted by the law-like explanations to be found in physics, and I'll throw chemistry in there too. The embedding itself, of course, is highly complex. It is not a matter of somehow trapping an otherwise independent mind in a body. Complex phenomena that resist description and explanation using the vocabulary of physics or chemistry alone, and of course the major examples here are both biology and psychology, call for an independent vocabulary and for explanations that operate at a different level and employ different structures from the arguably more basic and certainly more universally applicable vocabularies and explanatory structures of chemistry and physics. And let me be clear that I believe in the existence of such complex phenomena, but I also believe that that's an empirical matter, not an a priori given. The embedding of intentional phenomena, I'm supposed to do one of these. The embedding of intentional phenomena in the world is not simply a straightforward one of structural accumulation. And by that I mean that it's not simply the case that as physically and chemically describable structures get bigger or more internally complex, we occasionally have to introduce new vocabulary to simply abbreviate otherwise clumsily long and complex descriptions of the lower level in order to make them tractable for us. If the new vocabulary were merely abbreviational, then concepts of the biological and the mental would in fact be reducible to more basic physical and chemical concepts. Instead, we find, and again this is an empirical matter, that there are salient complex phenomena that are significant for our lives and the lives of the organisms we encounter that cannot be given a straightforward description, much less an explanation, in strictly physical or chemical terms, because, well, for instance, they are multiply instantiable in the physico-chemical realm. These phenomena, the higher level phenomena of biology and mentality, are generally functionally characterized, which means that they are identified and individuated in terms of a role in an encompassing system. This is, of course, a form of holism, since that encompassing system is implicit in their very conceptualization. That means that the complexity of biological or psychological phenomena is not simply the proper assembly of their parts, or rather, what counts as the proper assembly of the parts that constitute an organism or a thinking being is not itself to be explained without reference to other biological or psychological phenomena present in the system in which they must be located. This is not a case of vicious circularity, but rather of context sensitivity and inescapable historicity. But often, the essential dependence of the phenomena on an encompassing system is not evident. It can take years of philosophical labor and empirical labor to reveal. And while I think what I say is true of biological, sociological, and psychological concepts generally, here the issue is intentionality, so let me narrow my focus. In my view, intentionality is always tied to representation. I realize that there are some who want to develop non-representational theories of intentionality, but I find that they are really rejecting particular and bad understandings of representation. And there are, of course, some bad, although popular, theories of representation out there to reject. So with apologies to those theories of non-representationality, and with whom I do share some sympathies, I believe that there are innocent ways to talk about representation as long as one is not wedded to a bad theory of representation. So let me then begin with a few claims that I take to be crucial to a proper understanding of representations and intentionality. And the first claim is that every actual representation is itself also a physical-chemical phenomenon, although its physical-chemical description neither entails nor is entailed by its description as representation. The second claim is that every representation is the item it is because it is located and functions within a representational system. Now, representational systems come in many varieties, but fundamental for our purposes are what Sellers dubbed animal representation systems. I'll be borrowing a great deal from Wilfrid Sellers' treatment of representational systems in his essay, Mental Events, because I think it is a well-thought-through concept on which we can continue to build. Sellers' efforts there, or his effort there, is particularly aimed at developing a nominalistic theory of mind that also undercuts the idea that, quote, the presence or absence of a subject-predicate structure marks a radical difference between linguistic and non-linguistic representational systems. I will not be much concerned with the nominalism here, but continuities between animal and human thought will be important for me. Still, there are other aspects of Sellers' vision that he does not address that I intend to bring to the fore. So Sellers claims that, quote, it's up on the screen, to be a representational state, a state of an organism must be the manifestation of a system of dispositions and propensities by virtue of which the organism constructs maps of itself in its environment and locates itself and its behavior on the map. And that's a fairly minimal condition for him. Now, I take Sellers' claim here to be generally correct, but it's hardly complete. For one thing, he does not make clear enough that not every representational state in a sophisticated and particularly human representational system maps its environment, where that notion is taken fairly literally as constituting a plotting of the space-time locations of particular objects, paths connecting them, and in particular one's own location in that space. Sophisticated representational systems represent generalizations, for instance. They represent modalities, normatives, and these things don't show up on the map as such. But today I want to focus on another deficiency in his claim, or at least something that he doesn't bother to state. As he states it, it might well be the case that the system of dispositions and propensities in question is a purely individual phenomenon, unshared with anyone else. It could also be that the mechanisms by which the entity constructs its maps of itself in its environment are strictly law-driven and lack any normative dimension. A tree's growth rings, for instance, represent seasons and growing conditions, but I think that's a different sense of represent from the one that interests us. For one thing, the tree cannot get its growth rings wrong, at least as far as I know. For another, the tree does not use its growth rings to modulate its behavior in any interesting sense, though I'm, again, open to a forester telling me otherwise. But animals do use their representational states to modulate their activity, and that is why an animal representational system needs not only to portray the conditions around it, but also itself and its behavior. So we need to achieve greater clarity on the conditions governing what counts as a representation in an animal representational system. So it's almost a commonplace that linguistic representations must be items within a shared practice. That's, as I construe it, the point of the argument against the possibility of private languages. Not everyone buys the private language argument, but I do, and enough others do that I'm not going to bother defending it here. The languages we know are, of course, public languages, and linguistic activity is overt. It's out there, at least in principle, influencing and being influenced by others. But that hardly settles whether all intentionality must occur within some shared practice. Isn't there intentionality outside the confines of language? The possibility has been conceptualized in several different ways. The Cartesian, the hardcore Cartesian, who thinks of minds as metaphysically distinct from anything in space, easily accommodates the absolute autonomy of mental representations. And the Cartesians here include empiricists such as Bishop Berkeley and David Hume. The issues here do run deep. Without a common space in which non-spatial minds can contact and relate to each other, it isn't even clear how such minds could share much of anything, unless there's some form of spiritual connection among them, or a pre-established harmony, or some divinity to guarantee parallelism. Well, and how that might work, of course, we don't know. Hume, for instance, doesn't doubt that impressions and ideas are of something. They have representational content, and that is not dependent on language until we start to talk about abstract objects. But impressions and ideas are each and every one separable and independent. Minds are mere bundles of them, and for Hume, there's nothing incoherent in the existence of such a bundle with only one impression in it. Yet, Hume would still speak of it as possessing representational content. So, for those Cartesians, and the classical empiricists are also Cartesians in this regard, intentionality is possible entirely outside the realm of language used in public space. In fact, the Cartesians think of intentionality as a primary or basic characteristic of the minded. If language has meaning, it is only because it is an expression of thought, the intentionality of which is prior to any linguistic production. So, in the order of being, as it were, thought, both in the order of being and in the order of knowing, thought precedes language. So here's what I think we can grant the Cartesian, although some Cartesians would reject this form of the idea. There are clearly representers who are uncontaminated with language, namely animals. It may be the case that not everything we classify as an animal possesses what we call intentional states or representations, but I'm with Hume rather than Descartes here, in taking it to be clear that many of them, particularly the mammals and the higher orders, so to speak, do have intentionality. And in this regard, they pose a challenge to the idea that all intentionality rests on shared practices in a community. You can't fall back on, as it were, the private language argument to argue that animals have such things. So we get animal representational systems. So I begin my argument proper, when we now reach the argument proper, by thinking through what's required for animals to possess intentional states. If I can establish that such intentionality does rest on their participation in shared practices within their community, then the claim that a system of shared practices also undergirds complex human intentionality should seem fairly unproblematic. The private language argument then becomes a special case thereof. I will also need excuse me. I will also need to argue that the shared practices that I claim undergird animal intentionality do not themselves presuppose or require intentionality. Many human shared practices do presuppose intentionality, participation in organized games or in political activities, and those are not the kind of practices animals engage in. There are pretty strong arguments, I think, that infralingual animals and infralingual humans are not capable of collective intentionality in the superstructural sense. They do not seem to be able to conceptualize in terms of a we. Nonetheless, I claim, their intentionality is collective in the senses I am focusing on. Animal representation or intentionality requires participation in a shared practice that supports normative assessments. So that's the claim I'm going to defend, and of course, if I'm right, the private language sort of is mere icing on the cake. First off, I'm not denying that individual minds can develop highly idiosyncratic representations. A dog could come to see all bearded male humans as a threat, for instance. Animals are capable of learning, and learning modifies the representational system in the individual who learns without directly affecting the representational system present in other animals, even its conspecifics. The shared practices that underwrite intentionality are general structures of activity that do not preclude idiosyncratic activations and deviations from the general in individuals. So why must animals participate in shared normatively valenced practices in order to possess intentional states? One way to deny this is that it is a requirement of One way to deny that this is a requirement of representation is to say that insofar as animals possess representational systems, those systems are biologically determined and not amenable to normative assessment because they are purely natural. The basic biological capacities and dispositions in view here are not idiosyncratic to each individual animal. The animals share their basic dispositions and capacities with conspecifics the same way they share their genomes with them, pretty much. And that is not a matter of participating in a shared practice that supports normative assessments, or so it seems. This counter is an attempt to push biology, even the cognitive biology of sophisticated organisms, down into what I've called the realm of laws. If it works, the fact that animals of a given species share a certain cognitive system, a certain way of representing themselves and their environment in order to modulate their behavior, is sharing only in the sense that the planets share a common orbital form. But I think the counter is mistaken on several accounts. And to see why, we must distinguish between behaviors, laws, and practices. Behaviors are individual. A particular behavior can indeed occur just once in all of space-time. Both laws and practices are general. They are forms of regularity. They have instances, and the notion of a law or practice with only one instance, I think, is probably, well, close to nonsense. At least it would be undetectable as an instance of some particular law or practice. Laws and practices appear via regularities in patterns of behavior. Laws are determinative. They may not always be deterministic, but there's no such thing as a violation of a natural law. Practices, first of all, are behavioral, as I will use the term, although I understand behavior fairly broadly. But there's an interesting contrast between the behaviors and the structural features. Structural features of organisms are generally not absolutely determined by strict laws, so the law-practice contrast is not exclusive. There's something else in there about, for instance, biological structures. But, like practices as I understand them, such structural features of organisms, in fact, do live in the realm of norms. That dogs have 4 legs is not merely a statistical norm. Any dog with fewer or more than 4 legs is damaged or deformed. When a behavioral practice is a practice in the sense I intend, nonconformance is a violation of the norm. What accounts for it that norms now appear relevant in our descriptions of such structures and practices? I take it that a central fact is that the relevant structures and practices have been selected for. They have been selected for because those structures or behaviors contribute relevantly to sustaining or developing the organism or its activities. The norms remain tied to the purposes for which the structures or behaviors were selected. They are not, in any sense, graven in the structure of the world independently of the self-realizing nature of the organism. Of course, there are significantly different ways structures or practices can be selected. Classical natural selection is one. Deliberate selection via deliberation is certainly a different one. The norm in each case is reflected in a different kind of odd. At least it seems to have a different force. Roughly, natural selection produces something like ought to be's, and deliberation often aims at ought to do's. Nonconformance, of course, is possible. Nonconformant action may even become selected for at some point, and the practice changes. The notion of a practice I'm employing, I think, is a pretty thin one. I don't presume that the participants in a practice intend their participation as such. They need not even be aware of the practice as such. They may not even be capable of being aware of the practice as such. Practices need not themselves be actually collective possessions. Individuals can have idiosyncratic even practices. For instance, the practice of going out for Sunday brunch, or the practice of having tea for breakfast but coffee at the morning break. There's some motivational force driving the practice, even if it's only the force of habit or the force of instinct. And I don't believe that violating such an individual practice means that anything has gone wrong or made a mistake in, as it were, an objective sense, but the phenomenology is often that of a lack of something's being missing, or sort of a subjective kind of mistake has been made. It's my practice to restrict my intake to 2,000 calories a day. Ooh, I blew it last night. The Chateaubriand and Chateaubriand was just too good, and I ate too much. So I made a mistake. I'm wrong. But, would anyone else think, oh, that was a big mistake? Probably not. If one has established a personal, well, I've already said that. I'd also argue that such a subjective attitude toward the violation of a personal rule is possible only for a being that participates in shared social practices from which that sense of right and wrong is derived. But there are then also social practices that are not just recurrent patterns of individual behavior, but recurrent patterns of behavior across individuals, how they react to the world, and especially how those individuals interact. With social practices, the possibility of error and mistake, in a much more objective sense, at least in an intersubjective sense, becomes available. And at this point, we begin the transition from an individual practice as a norm that you might say is a fairly descriptive norm to a social practice that really has a norm in a much more strongly evaluative sense, because others can hold you to it. One of the ways social practices are important is that the existence of such a practice is often a condition of the very possibility of certain behaviors or actions. Call these constitutive social practices. Castling is possible only within the social practice of playing chess. Drawing a base on balls is possible only within the practice of baseball. While the individual practices need not carry any normative weight, social practices almost always do. If I miss my normal Sunday brunch or have a different breakfast, it isn't normally the case that one could say I have done something wrong or something went wrong. But if I try castling when the castling conditions are not met, or if I don't go to first base after ball 4, I've done something wrong. And others can criticize me and hold me to it. All right, so far, my examples of social practices, and particularly constitutive social practices, have all been practices that are consciously created and consciously engaged in. But that's not true for all such practices. Consider the animal practices, such as animal communication systems, for instance, the bee dance or the macaque warning calls. Consider mating rituals, group hunting strategies, grooming behaviors. None of these behaviors are governed by explicitly formulated rules, and there does not seem to be much reason to think that the animals engage in them by express decision. It is significant that many of them involve communication or cooperation. They're called forth under specific conditions without forethought by the animals. But there are right ways and wrong ways to engage in them. Mistakes can be made. These are social practices, though not all of them are learned social practices. I claim that whether they are learned or not doesn't matter as far as we're concerned. That's only a matter of the process by which the behaviors are selected. And that may have ramifications, but it's not really, I think, relevant for my claims here. The interesting thing about them is that there are right and wrong ways to engage in the practice. So I claim this is a function of there being social practices that are selected for and shared across a community. And in the animal cases, this is most often, though not always, the species. So for instance, bird songs can differ regionally, and getting the bird song right won't be across the whole species, but will pertain to those birds of that kind in that region. Shared animal practices, such as the above, have been selected for by that stern teacher, evolution. The processes of natural selection operate outside any animal consciousness. They operate slowly on a generational basis. It is selection without a selector, and as Dan Dennett would say, yields designerless design. People often think of evolution as operating on the physical design of the animal body, at least that's what I found among my students. And it took them another think to realize that it operates on behavioral profiles as well. Certain patterns of behavior are selected for because the presence of those patterns in the species, in that environment, affords it some selective advantage compared with their competitors without that shared behavioral pattern. Sometimes a behavioral pattern is straightforwardly beneficial to the individual organism, whether taken up by others or not. Such patterns can become prevalent or even dominant in the population via selection. Some achieve prevalence through learning, though that is not itself a piece of evolution, I don't think. I think I may have lost one. Yeah. Sorry, as I said, I have trouble coordinating my mouth and my hand. I can't chew gum and walk either, so I don't choose gum. Constitutive social practices are necessary for cooperation and communication. Some behavioral patterns are beneficial only if shared. This is, I believe, almost always the case where cooperation and communication are in play, where the behavior requires both output from some and uptake by others. The shared behavioral pattern sets a standard against which the behaviors of individuals can be judged. Is the individual behavior in fact a mistake, out of conformance with the pattern, or is it correctly done? Now, it's not the case that all such shared practices underlie representational systems, but without this more primitive set of structures, attributing representation to organisms, I think, would not be justifiable. Interpreting the bee dance as a representation of the direction and distance to a food source makes sense only because, in fact, it's not a singular individual activity, but shared across the species in both its performance and its uptake, in that the input that occasions it, in the input that occasions it and the output that it occasions. What's going on when we attribute an intentional state to some other? Here again, I think Sellers gives us good guidance. Sellers thinks that the concepts we employ in talking about intentional states are rooted in being used to explain, well, he actually thinks it's rooted in being explaining human behavior. Their application to animals, he thinks, is an analogical extension of the framework originally developed to describe and explain human behavior. I'm not sure I'm on board with that part of it, but that's the way he thinks about it. Of course, this does not mean that human intentionality is somehow prior to animal intentionality. It only means that the development of the framework of concepts of intentionality was focused on coming to terms with our fellow humans, and once developed, extended to explaining such much animal behavior as well. For Sellers, the explanatory function of concepts of intentionality is itself primary. The way we attribute intentional states to others and explain the significance of those states is unique, however, special to the framework of intentionality. When we attribute to another the belief, hope, or desire that P, we're attributing to that other an internal state that plays within its engaged representational system a role relevantly similar to that played in our lives by P and the associated mode or propositional attitude towards it, the belief, hope, desire, which each have different ways of engaging behavior. To the extent that we understand how intentional states with content B are positioned in our own system of coping with the world, such attributions afford us explanations of the other's behavior. Animal representational systems are less complex in their logical structure than those of language-infested humans. So we cannot justifiably attribute to an animal a highly determinate, complex intentional state, but there's still plenty of reason to believe that there are deep-reaching similarities of function between their representational states and many of ours. It's important to understand, however, that in attributing to another, whether human or animal, a state that plays a role similar to the role played by P in my linguistic system, well, my linguistic system is in fact necessarily our linguistic system, the linguistic system I share with my community. For one thing, I can misstate something's or someone's meaning if my own idiolect does not accurately reflect the general usage in the community. Such cases would be instances of the kind of phenomenon that Burge exploited in his arguments against individualism. For another, if my intentional attribution or meaning explanation were to cite on its right-hand side, right, rot in German means red, if it were to cite on its right-hand side a token of something from, for instance, a private language, rather than a token of a common and shared language, well, no one else would be able to understand what I've said. The general rule has to be that the pragmatics of attributions of intentions make sense and function appropriately in contexts of explanation and description because they pull their material from or exploit the availability of a shared resource. I think this carries over to the intentional states attributed to other organisms. The state the organism is in must play its role, not merely idiosyncratically, but within the representational practice shared by the organism's community. In animals, usually it's conspecifics. In figuring out what the state of another, human or animal, is, we cannot usually count on sufficient evidence to establish a good call based solely on that other's actual behaviors. So we understand the behavior of that other as seen in the context of the behavioral profile of the relevant population. The mating behaviors of animals, for instance, well, they can be pretty weird. You know, you've got all these interesting natural photographers taking interesting and sometimes funny film of the mating behavior of birds and things like that. They can be pretty weird, considered in themselves, but when you see them as elements in a shared practice of give and take, a way of cooperating or not, they make sense. And woe unto the animal that gets the mating behaviors wrong. The communicative behaviors of animals depend essentially on practices shared within the communicative community. Human representational systems. I hope I've said enough to show that animal representation systems can never be the possession of isolated individual organisms, but certainly in those animals capable of cooperative or communicative behavior must always be a collective possession rooted in a base of shared practices within a community. Human representational systems are a special case, then, of animal representation systems, and must also be rooted in a complex set of practices shared within a community. But it's also clearly the case that human representational systems are a very special case of animal representations, and it's well worth asking why human intentionality seems not merely a special case in the animal world, but at least arguably different in kind in some important ways from, quote, mere animal intentionality. The easy response is that the presence of language in humans makes a difference, perhaps all the difference. But then why? One standard answer is that language enables the human representational system to employ subject-predicate structure, which opens up realms of potential thought inaccessible to animals. And particularly if you think of now you get access to the realm of properties. But as I mentioned earlier, Sellers, whom we've taken as a guide here, rejects the idea that the presence or absence of a subject-predicate structure marks a radical difference between linguistic and non-linguistic RSs. He thinks that even simple maps consist of representations that both refer to an object and characterize that object, the fundamental jobs performed in subject-predicate structures. Even relatively simple animal representational systems have such a capacity. So he proposes instead that, quote, the crucial distinction is between logic using RSs and RSs which do not use logic, though their operations are described by mentioning logical operations. Now, Sellers doesn't end up making this all that clear, why this is the crucial distinction, so I'm going to try to do a slightly better job. I'm not sure how much better, but I'll try to do it. First of all, by using logic, he does not mean thinking logically or being disposed to make good inferences. Animals do those things well enough. General inferential competence, in fact, is a condition on every organism with a representational system. Logic users, rather, possess logical expressions in their vocabulary. They not only generally make good inferences, but are able to represent the forms of inference they use. The possession of logical expressions in one's vocabulary enables one to make explicit and to thematize the inferential connections among the representations and that, in his view, constitute the content of those representations. With a vocabulary containing logical expressions, as well as first-order referring terms and characterizations, one can not only think about things, one can begin to think about how one thinks about things, about whether one's inferences and generalizations are good or bad. That's the feature that enables one's representational system to be improved not by the hard, slow, bloody, and irrational process of evolution, but rather by explicit, intentional procedures aimed at making our cognitive abilities and achievements ever more capable of coping with the reality they encounter. The presence of logical words, and for Sellers, that means not just the sentential connectives and the quantifiers, but also terms for probability, modal terms, the subjunctive mood even, and arguably psychological attitudes, enables an organism to vault from being a Humean inference engine, capable of material inferences, to what he calls an Aristotelian inference engine, still capable of material inferences, of course, but now also capable of formally valid inferences and espousing explicit logical principles. And with those capacities comes the capacity to criticize, to worry about methodology, and perhaps most important, to theorize. The presence of logical words in sophisticated thinkers only reinforces the fact that the complex intentional states they are capable of ride upon an ocean of shared practices in the use of such a complex vocabulary. For the concepts embodied in our logical vocabulary express a hard-won recognition of something that must already have developed to a significant degree in the constitutive practices of human communication. Material inferences, the ability to move in legitimate ways from one representation to another, are essential to the structure of any animal representational system. If the system did not permit some such inferences and disallow others, permitting the organism to take up information about its environment and use it to project its activities therein, there would be no point in calling it a representational system. Developing a system that permits not only such material inferences, but also the representation of the cognitive status of its representations and the inferential structures it employs is an incredibly significant move. We have to assume that it was not itself made deliberately. It must have been an evolutionary development and can only have occurred in a population that already possessed a robust set of shared material inferential structures. Still, we can imagine, as it were, the logic of such a move. So, forget my claim that this addition of the vocabulary of logic must have been evolutionary and not intentional. Imagine a community of pre-Rileyans. This is, calling on the little thought experiment that Sellers runs at the end of EPM. Imagine a community of pre-Rileyans who have the ability to express overtly descriptions of objects and states of affairs, to express as well intentions to act within their environment and to move around within this limited universe of discourse in reasonable ways. They do not yet have the ability to go sufficiently meta to to express explicitly which positions in their representational system and which material moves are good or bad, or to qualify their strength of appropriateness. If you run into someone making a bad inference, you might, along with Bob Brandom, beat him soundly with sticks or something like that to get him to change his behavior. Frustrated by the inability of some of his fellows to make the right moves when connecting their descriptions and intentions, along comes a character we'll call Pre-Jones, and suggests that they adopt a new word, such that an assertion of P, together with an assertion of Q, legitimates asserting P and Q. And, he adds, if there's an assertion of P and Q, that legitimates an assertion of P, and it legitimates an assertion of Q. Okay, and it turns out that Pre-Jones has a bevy of cousins, nephews, nieces, family relations, etc., and they chip in some new terms that enable the explicit codification of many of the shared inferential practices already in hand. The addition of if-then is of particular significance. The expressive power of their original minimalist language is thereby vastly increased, and they are ready to add modals, quantifiers, and even psychological constructs and other structures. Without the ocean of shared practices distributed throughout the community, none of the sophisticated intentionality that they learn to float upon it would be possible. We can start worrying, then, about the phenomena usually worried about under the heading of collective intentionality, only if there is a broad and deep pool of shared practices, especially cooperative and communicative practices, upon which further superstructural forms of cooperation and communication can be built. Thank you.
We have 17 minutes for questions. Keep your hands up.
Long? I'm sorry.
Keep your hands up until I've got your names down. Stephanie, we'll start with you.
So thank you, that was fascinating. I wanted to ask, or maybe continue where we left our discussion before the talk. It seems that you see two sources for intentionality, the normativity that could be either generated within social practices or by evolution, and then sociality, collectivity of some kind, maybe a very low-level kind. But I was wondering whether we really, for some kind of low-level form of individual intentionality, whether we really need to presuppose the collective element. Take an animal species like frogs. I think that frogs are rather solitary, at least some of them. They don't care for their offspring, right? But still, you could say when the fly goes bzzz and the frog flicks out its tongue, right, that why shouldn't it make sense to say that the frog has a representation of the fly, maybe not as a fly, right, but some kind of representation of the fly, and this is what triggers the tongue, right? So a kind of Millicanian account of why this is an intentional mental state. Why should that be so implausible? Why should you need the collective element besides the evolutionary one here?
What do you mean by besides the evolutionary one? I mean, that's where I would go, right? If you want to say that the frog is representing the fly, you shoot a pellet of something else by it, and it still throws out its tongue. It's getting it wrong in some way. Again, I do think it's reasonable to think that you can say that it's representing at least maybe not a fly, but at least a food, because it's doing what its species does. Right? If there were a single frog and it did something to gain that got it food, but in a way that no other frogs did, would you be justified in saying that it has a representation of food that it's acting on? I actually think no, you'd be hard put to make that case.
Yeah, okay, I see that you need other frogs in the account, right? The ancestors of that frog,
right.
At least. But is that this is a very, very thin notion of collectivity, right? Maybe you are fine with that, but doesn't it water it down, this concept of collectivity, quite a lot?
It may, but there may be different densities. I don't know what's the opposite of watering down. So for animals with pretty restricted representational systems, a fairly watered down notion is all that's going to be there. But as the animal, as you move up, as it were, the scale and cognitive complexity, it'll be less and less watered down. You'll need a thicker kind of, or you'll at least be able to make sense of a thicker kind of collectivity, I think. But that seems to me just right. That doesn't bother me at all. And we have, with humans, a very pretty dense sense of collectivity. Children who aren't raised and socialized within a linguistic community have limited ability to use language. They're left with a very thin sense of communication, very thin communicative ability, shall we say. So, yeah.
I think I may have missed some hands. So I had Jeremy, Heath, Preston, Bernard, was someone else, and Bill. Okay, so we're going to go with Bernard next.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must admit I have the same issue as Stephanie, and I did enlist the help of ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT what species is the biggest challenge for your view. Mm-hmm. And it came up with the octopus. So the octopus hatches from the egg and floats freely in the ocean and then develops, and it lives alone. Mating behavior in the octopus is an attack among conspecifics who are perfectly willing to eat each other up. So it's really a short attack and then flight. It's not the tongue and getting a fly, it's actual tool use. So they solve problems by looking for tools to solve the problem. It's very harsh to say that this doesn't require the intentional stance. So they know what they are doing. Although they do not live together, and in these instances, you cannot even say that, well, that tool use is what the octopus does, because it's totally idiosyncratic. So how is this not a killer case for your argument?
I don't think so, because because once again, I think that the octopus, that it's not, one genius octopus among a bunch of dumb shits. The octopi are highly, we'll call them highly evolved. Evolution has been very good to them by giving them capacities to learn things and to be able to manipulate tools. They've used their the facility of their the appendages very well. So you keep wanting to fall back on the idea that, well, they don't have to engage in a lot of socialization in order to do it, but I'm not counting on socialization to be the only way in which a shared practice can be acquired. I think evolution sometimes does that job. In fact, it's done that job in a whole number of cases. I don't think that, the fact that the ants have very specific job descriptions and fulfill them, it's not because they've learned how to do that or been trained to do that. It's born in them. It's instinctual. And your ability to interpret the octopus's behavior is so damned intelligent is because you haven't encountered just this one, genius octopus. You recognize that there is, in fact, these are really significantly clever beings, and you try and cage them, and they'll likely figure out a way to open the cage or get out somehow. But again, it's because that's shared across the species that sounds right to me, and that you have enough evidence to make a good and an assignment of intentional states, of intentionality in general to them, that stands up under investigation. So it's a really good case, but I don't think it runs counter to my argument.
Jeremy.
Thank you. I find your thesis super plausible about sort of our kind of intentionality. I think, I guess maybe what part of the stumbling block for me is it seems like maybe you're using collective intentionality in kind of a non-standard way. I think you're proposing kind of a revisionary definition of it.
Well, that's why I talk about the collective substructure of intentionality. It's not collective intentionality like what we've been talking about for the past couple days. But I don't have a whole lot to say about that.
Well, hear me out for a second. So there's a couple of different phenomena here. So, Bryce Hubner in his book Macrocognition talks about, for example, bees. And he describes the phenomena of when, a beehive decides that it needs to move because its area has become resource poor. And it sends out bee scouts in different directions. And there's this whole algorithm for deciding which direction is the best direction to move based on the behavior of bees upon returning. But no individual bee knows which direction to move. There's basically a complex algorithm that the hive uses to determine where to go. And so it's plausible to say that the hive knows where to go, whereas no individual bee has. So this is an example of sort of cognition on a group scale. But you don't attribute any sort of this knowledge or cognition to any individual bee. It's group cognition. But it's not collective intentionality of any individual bee. It's collective intentionality of the collective. But when you're talking about collective intentionality of sort of individual organisms, I think maybe the stumbling block for people like me is we're wedded to this idea that, and this is something I talked about in my paper, is I think a lot of the sort of the talk about. I think we're wedded, at least I'm wedded to this sort of Tomasello idea that sort of collective, and what we need is creatures that are capable of joint attention or sharing mental states or something like that. And so, Tomasello makes a pretty convincing case. I think that humans are the only animal we know of that does that. Even higher primates like chimpanzees that look like they cooperate aren't really cooperating even when they hunt as a group. They're not capable of joint attention. They're not capable of sharing mental states. And so this is the reason why someone like Tomasello is not going to actually attribute collective intentionality to other animals because they're not capable of sharing mental states. And so I think, a stumbling block for people like me is, they're not subjects of collective intentionality because they can't actually share the same mental state. And so that's why I say that, I think you have a revisionary conception of collective intentionality because, I'm coming at this, having drunk the Tomasello Kool-Aid, I guess. And so I think that there are certain cognitive presuppositions. That's where what I am. That's the presupposition I'm coming in with, which I'm willing to be corrected on. Cognitive presuppositions that only humans satisfy.
Well, I think you're sort of misunderstanding what I'm trying to do. I've noted that. Sorry. The talk of collective intentionality that has been center stage here for most of the conference is worried about how to go from a bunch of different individuals with certain kind of mental states to the idea that there's some coordination among them that deserves the title of collective intentionality in this, what I've called declared ignorance of it, and I will steadfastly insist upon my ignorance on that score. But I do think there are important things to think about on, okay, so the individual becomes sort of the, often conceived of as the basic atom that the language of intentionality applies to. How can we apply it? Think, well, okay, I want to say something about the idea that, and again, as I said fairly early on, the general thrust of my argument is against that kind of individualism that says that, well, individuals can have intentional states, and who cares what the hell else is going on in the world? And that, again, highly Cartesian conception of intentionality, I think, is fundamentally wrong. And so I'm trying to say, okay, maybe there's a bunch of stuff that comes together in the individual, and then you can start worrying about how to construct higher levels of intentionality. I leave that to people like Kurt and Bernhard to figure out. They worry about that a lot more than I ever have. But I'm worried about thinking about, as it were, the substructure, like the undersea part of the iceberg. Because if you get that wrong, all the other stuff that moves on top of the iceberg isn't going to be really well thought through or well grounded. So I'm not trying to revise the idea of collective intentionality and say that all animals have some form of collective intentionality. But I am saying that there are collective. That's why I kept talking about social practices, and I know I haven't defined that well enough, clearly enough. But you can have a practice that involves, not in any clear sense, any kind of intentionality. If you don't have the practice, you can't really, the shared practice, you can't really have a justified attribution of an intention either.
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay, we have 2 minutes and 3 questions, so brief exchanges. Preston.
I think a version of my question was basically asked by Steffi, so I'll cede my ground. I will just say that about octopi, they have the really weird, their DNA was sequenced recently, the really weird DNA sequence. Some people think they're actually extraterrestrial, that they come from, some of this stuff has been published, actually. It sounds crazy, but it's an interesting case that ChatGPT would come up with. I wonder what it was thinking.
Bill.
This is sort of about octopuses, but it's really about a potential ambiguity in the notion of a shared practice. So, it seems to me that there's 2 different things that people might mean by a practice being shared. And I'm worried that you sort of tried to get us to slip from one to the other. So, you say sort of, suppose we're talking about sort of our beverage preferences, and you might say to me, yeah, it's my practice to drink tea at breakfast and coffee at the coffee break. And I might say to you, yeah, I have the same practice.
Okay.
Meaning, my behavior matches yours, and when you would say to yourself, I've made a mistake, I would say to myself, I've made a mistake, right? Okay. In that sense, we can share a practice without ever interacting or even being aware of one another or something like that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's another sense, and if we say of a group of people, they share a practice in that sense, it's going to be a distributive claim, right? Each of them. But it seems to me that there's another sense of shared practice where you need more than that, right? Okay. So, here's what you might need. Like, I do this and you do this. And I correct, that can happen without us ever thinking it's appropriate for me to correct your choice of beverage, right? Okay.
Right.
But it looks as though there's another sense of shared practice where, for it to be the same practice rather than matching practices, it has to be the case that sort of different people correct one another's behavior.
Okay.
Yeah? So it looks as though with octopuses, right, they can share practices in the distributive sense.
Right.
But it doesn't look as though they ever share practices in the sort of non-distributive sense, where it can be our practice without it ever being my practice. Now, I guess sort of the worry that somebody might have is, look, I can see that once you've got shared practices, you've got enough for intentionality. But I think it has to be shared practices in this non-distributive sense. And I think this also, I think a lot of discussion of the private language argument sort of overlooks. People say, yeah, it doesn't have to be shared, it just has to be shareable. Mm-hmm. But what they mean by shareable is sort of shareable in this sort of distributive sense. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think, the sort of, what Wittgenstein wants is it's got to be shareable in the sense of it's got to be something where we've got this sort of non-distributive type sharing. So what?
I think at one point you did talk about having these shared practices sufficient for intentionality, and I don't think I've ever made that claim. The claim is that a ground of shared practices is a necessary condition for intentionality. I don't think it has to be sufficient. I'm not sure what to add to make it sufficient. So that's one small thing. Otherwise, yeah, I think you're basically right. That's one of the reasons why I focused on, I thought I tried to make that clear, focused on practices that only work, only, as it were, do their job if they are mutual in the sense that, there's an output and an intake, and how you uptake your partner's or the other's behavior is crucial. There has to be that kind of a coordination, so that it's not merely two trolleys running parallel. There's interaction necessary to sustaining it. So I think I didn't make that distinction between the distributive and the, you might want to call it joint, I'm not quite sure what the right word there is, clear enough, and that's something I should do. But I think I did try to steer us towards thinking about those more deeply shared practices as what's really underlying, and as something without which not, for intentionality.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Keith,
Sorry I
but
went on, that we had
we've
less
run
time
out
to
of time.
discuss.
So let's thank Bill.